IVM.
We would like to thank HDFC Life Insurance for supporting this show. HDFC Life Insurance has created an online video series called Behind the Journey with some of the most interesting people from the creative and entertainment industry. It explores the stories that are behind the glitz and glamour of the spotlight and screaming fans. Let's listen to a snippet from the episode featuring actor Jitendra Kumar.
Initially, जब मैं बहुत ऐसे कुछ चीज नहीं वर्क कर रही है एक्टिंग में, तो मैं बहुत पैनिक कर जाता था. तो काफी लोग मुझे सलाह देते थे कि नहीं, मतलब उतना पैनिक मत कर, मतलब धीरे धीरे ग्रो करेंगी चीजें. तो जिस तरह से तुम्हारा काम धीरे धीरे ग्रो करता है, एक दिन में नई चीजें मिलती हैं. आई थिंक तुम्हारा जो फाइनेंशियल साइड है उस पर भी तुम्हें ध्यान देना चाहिए, और वो भी धीरे धीरे डेवलप होता है. वो भी एक दिन में नहीं होता, और वो होने लगता है.
As Jitu said, steady growth is a good sign for both your finances and the journey of your dreams. You can watch all episodes of Behind the Journey on HDFC Life Insurance YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/HDFC Life. Take control of your personal goals with HDFC Life Insurance's financial solutions. Plan now with HDFC Life Insurance.
Terms and conditions apply. HDFC Life Insurance Company Limited, IRDAI registration number 101.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to All Things Policy. It's that time of the week again, so we are reading The Economist. I have with me Anirudh and Sarthak, and we're going to look at the latest issue of The Economist and discuss issues ranging from refugees in Turkey to the impact of the Wuhan virus. I want to start with you, Anirudh. You've read a story that it has two words that are not normally seen in the same sentence: slavery and universities.
Well, I think one of the most pervasive myths about the world's economic history is the fact that Europe's pulling ahead of the rest of the world, its rapid economic development, was based purely on some kind of liberal value or some kind of massive technological progress. These are definitely parts of the explanation, but another really, really big part of why the West pulled ahead, why the West won over the East, as it were, is slavery. And I think that a lot of people don't really appreciate the sheer scale of the slavery that happened along the Atlantic coast. We're talking about literally millions of human beings with lives just as rich and humane as ours, being uprooted from their homes, being transported across the oceans in absolutely inhumane conditions, being quite literally reduced to an economic asset, and thus being used to generate value for landowners, slave owners sitting in the US, in Brazil, and of course in Britain. Now, this article talks about how various universities in Britain are engaging with this, grappling with this problem, because a lot of slave owners, people who might not necessarily have been slavers in the sense that they're not guys who are actually going and kidnapping people from Africa and sending them off to these places, but people who are investing more generally in the slave trade, who might own one or two slaves that they've bought basically in a market somewhere indirectly, that they've bought the deeds to, that they've never actually seen, but who are basically slaving away for them in the Caribbean, in plantations in the southern part of the US, in Brazil, and so on and so forth, and thus generating money for them. And these people could be upstanding members of British society. They could be people who are funding education. They could be people who are fighting for women's rights and so on and so forth. But it doesn't change the fact that a lot of the donations that they made to universities were built on the backs of slave labor. And a lot of universities now are actually beginning to engage with this darker legacy of theirs. A lot of their endowments, some of the biggest events that they conduct throughout the year are actually funded by endowments that were originally made by people who owned slaves. Just to give you an interesting statistic that the article quotes, now abolitionists, people who were actually fighting for slavery to be made illegal throughout the territories of the British Empire, had to borrow 20 million pounds from Nathan Rothschild, who was a banker. I think this was sometime in the 19th century. And that 20 million pounds back then accounted for 40% of the British Treasury's annual income then. 40%. That was equivalent to about 5% of Britain's GDP that year. And take a guess as to when the Treasury finished paying it off.
Early 21st century?
Yeah, 2015. it took 150 years for Britain to compensate owners of slaves because they supposedly lost their property. And as good as the whole project of abolishing slavery was, it's absolutely ridiculous that it had to be brought at such an enormous economic cost when you never really had that kind of reparation given to slaves or the descendants of slaves. This, of course, is something that I've really grappled with, because when you think of colonial reparations, especially to a country like India, which suffered abominably under the British Raj, it's very difficult to think of like a system that would simultaneously do justice to the horrors that were perpetrated by the Raj, but also be something that the British are willing to like actually do. Now, in the case of the anti-abolition movement, these are basically British people who have some backing from religious authorities, who have a considerable backing from MPs and so on and so forth. So that was something they were able to push through because it was a humanitarian issue. We don't know how something like that in a colonial reparatory context would work, because let's face it, I don't think Britain has the GDP, will ever have the GDP required to repay all its former colonies. That said, it's interesting to see the way that some of these universities at least are grappling with this problem.
I wonder what the universities get out of it.
I mean, they get great branding. I mean, showing that you're just and that you care for justice is really, really great. And as messed up as that is, the fact remains that at least you are addressing in some way the injustice of the past. The fact remains that you are talking about it and not just sweeping it under the carpet. And I think this is something that India especially needs to do, not just for the colonial context, but India has a huge history of like the appropriation, subjugation of tribal peoples, for example, of lower caste peoples, for example, and of women, of course. That right now the tendency seems to be to sweep all these injustices under the carpet instead of necessarily talking about them. But the University of Glasgow, for example, is setting up a center to talk about like who are the people who are these slaves whose labor helped fund the university today. Setting it up in the Caribbean, talking about the histories of slaves and so on and so forth. And though Glasgow, of course, is getting plenty out of it, it's not necessarily reparations. You're not really necessarily paying stuff back to the descendants of slaves, but it's reparatory justice. It's penance in a way. And it matters. I think that counts for something.
So when we're talking about penance here, it strikes me that this penance doesn't always have to be monetary. Penance can be actually more effective when it takes the form of institutions, when it takes the form of libraries, of education. And maybe that's the way to go ahead with, say, colonial reparations.
Absolutely. I would think that one really great way to get started at least would be for Britain to set up a museum to house the Amaravati marbles, technically limestones, but they're still sitting in the British Museum. They're an absolutely priceless part of India's antiquity. If the British were to set up a museum here, I'm damn sure that a lot of South Indians would absolutely pay to get into it and help maintain it through our own money. But the very thought of them coming back, giving it to us, issuing a formal apology saying that, yeah, we didn't just quote unquote borrow it for safekeeping, we did steal it, that's on us, but what can we do to make it better? We need to have these conversations, and I think developed countries especially should take the lead in doing this. How to create the political will to do that, of course, is another question, given that Britain literally just exited Europe, the continent which has had the longest and most complex historical relationship with. But a guy can dream.
One thing I do wonder is, of course, how you can ever make reparations, or at least financial reparations, for slavery, the mass displacement of people, the appropriation of their lives over generations. And I assume that there is absolutely no way to do that. But, I just want to move on to natural threats to our economic progress. And Sarthak, you've been reading about the Wuhan virus and its impact on China's economy and the way, China is obviously linked to the supply chains globally. How is this virus taking a toll on both China's economy domestically and internationally?
So, Aditya, there was this article related to the impact of coronavirus attack on China in The Economist. And it gives you the entire scenario, what is happening right now. So, for the Chinese New Year, offices were shut, factories were shut. And this outbreak of coronavirus happens in January. So most of these offices and factories are shut even now. And as for the official instructions, it should be shut till February 10th. And hotels, services sector, restaurants, people are not going over there because, again, large part of these provinces, they are quarantined. So again, these are taking a hit. Not only this, farmers, they are also facing the brunt because many places there are roadblocks. So if roadblocks are there, they're not able to get their inputs. So at different places, you will face these issues. Now, there was this estimate that the Chinese economy will grow by 6% in this quarter. But again, the recent estimates are that it will be around 4%. And the stock markets have also crashed.
So 2% drop
decrease.
in GDP growth
And
rate.
keep in mind
That's
that
huge.
Yeah, that's huge. And keep in mind that 6% is also less.
Yeah.
Before this, they were growing at even higher rates. So the conservative estimate was 6%, and now they're estimating that it will be growing at 4%. So this is definitely going to impact the domestic economy. But what is also important is you should note that what is going to be the impact on the international economy. Because China accounts for one of the largest number of tourists. Chinese students, they also account for, again, one of the largest population of students in different parts of the world.
And there's a simple matter of Chinese manufacturing.
Yes.
Not just finished goods, but also intermediary goods that...
And also, many countries depend on China for raw materials.
Yeah.
Okay, so that is also going to be impacted. So again, how long will the impact be? We are not very sure. But what empirical evidence suggests is whenever you have these kind of outbreaks, these kind of disease outbreaks, epidemic outbreaks, most likely the impact remains for 1 year. But again, within that 1 year period, we don't know when exactly things will start looking good. So here again, maybe it will be dependent on 2-3 factors. One factor is how long will it take China to contain the spread of the virus. Second is when will the government stop all the kind of restrictions. Third is when the society will start participating. So depending on all these 3 factors, again, how the economy will take its direction.
That last bit seems to me that the trickiest aspect of it. How do you get people out on the streets again when there's this huge atmosphere of
fear,
that
panic?
has been,
Yeah, exactly.
created?
So that is going to be a massive problem. But again, human beings are rational, and again, there will be compulsions. They have to move out. What can they do?
Yeah. Speaking of people who've had to move out forcibly, you read a story on Syrian refugees in Turkey. What's happening there?
About 80% of Turkish people now think that Syrian refugees should go back, which is quite a stark contrast to how the whole situation started, because when refugees first began to move from Syria to Turkey, they were basically welcomed with open arms as brothers, basically. I mean, of course, a lot of Syrians have started to put down roots. In border towns, you'll start to see, for example, young Turkish people and Syrian people now hanging out in like cafes and hookah bars and Syrian women wearing hijabs in the Turkish style and Turkish women wearing it in the Syrian style and so on and so forth. So there is that sort of cultural fusion that's happening, which is absolutely fascinating to see happening in front of our eyes in real time. But on the other hand, there's also this nativist turn in Turkish politics. And of course, these many refugees, I think there's over 3.6 million at this point, of which at least 110,000 have already been given Turkish citizenship. It's putting an enormous strain on Turkey's infrastructure, which might not necessarily be indefinitely sustainable. So, of course, the Turkish President Erdogan, one of the reasons why the Turkish army has kept attacking Syria and trying to make inroads and uproot rebels and so on and so forth, is because he wants to resettle these Syrian refugees back in Syria, even if they have no intention of actually doing that themselves. That's kind of been a flop, because thanks to Russia's support, the Syrian regime is far stronger now than it has been in years. And now that the Syrian regime and Russia are actually pushing against the last rebel-held stronghold, once again, we have thousands of refugees who are amassing at the borders, which is something that Erdogan is absolutely furious about, because the Syrian regime is doing this with Russia's support. And he's basically he's made a few statements that are obviously designed to piss off the Russians. He said that the annexation of Crimea was illegitimate, which is in a visit to Ukraine, which is absolutely huge. But this article argues that it's unlikely that Erdogan will risk a military confrontation with Russia, which I think makes sense. Russia still has a lot of levers it can pull over Turkey, which also needs to be seen in the broader context of competition between Russia and Turkey within West Asia. Libya is another interesting battleground where all this is happening. So oil resources in Libya, as you can understand, are obviously something that both Turkey and Russia want control over. Turkey, through its support behind an internationally backed coalition, whereas Russia basically set up its own warlord, sent him weapons, sent private military contractors to help him out, and so on and so forth. And it certainly seems like this is the guy who's going to win the Libyan civil war, as it were. This is the guy who's going to be controlling oil resources. So Turkey, as under Erdogan, has been following a sort of quote-unquote neo-Ottoman policy. It sees West Asia as being within its natural sphere of influence, of course, which again is an idiotic example of how historical legends don't make for good policy today, right? But that's where Turkey is right now.
I want to move from the Middle East to something very different. I want to come back to India. Sarthak, you read a story about microfinance in India.
Yeah. In The Economist, there is an article about small finances, and it is about the successful venture Ujjivan Microfinance. Now, in case of India, when it comes to accessing finances, we face different kind of difficulties, especially people who are from the poorer sections of the society. And here you have again different options. Poor people might take loans from some of their relatives, their friends. They might be dependent on different kind of membership-based institutions like cooperatives, self-help groups. Some of them might be accessing finances from informal money lenders who charge a very high rate of interest. And at the same point of time, nowadays we are having new kind of institutions like the microfinance institutions. And traditionally we have had the banks, the commercial banks. So each of these kind of methods of borrowing have their own limitations, have their issues, and not many of them are very successful. So in this sector, in the month of December, we find a new development. Ujjivan, which is a microfinance entity which has been there for a long period of time, since 2005, it got listed. Not only it is getting investors, it is also that the share prices of Ujjivan also increased drastically in this last 1 month. So it is one of the success story in the microfinance sector, and again, which is very relevant for the present context. Now, to give you a number, in case of India, around 80% of the people are financially included right now. The number used to be around 53% in 2014. Because of certain government schemes, it has increased. But again, look at the numbers. 20% people, if they're not financially included, absolute numbers will be huge. And there have been multiple studies which find out the direct correlationship between financial inclusion, deepening of financial inclusion, and increasing GDP of the countries and decreasing income inequalities. So one of the positives that has happened, that is happening, this success story is pointing out that maybe we are moving in that positive direction.
Okay. What does it take to deepen financial inclusion and to extend it to the remaining 20%?
Yeah. So first of all, we need to understand what is the problem here. Okay. Now, one major problem is you do not have these institutions everywhere. Inaccessibility is there. On top of that, there is high information asymmetry. That means people are not aware of these kind of schemes. One disclaimer here, I was part of one of the financial institution. So I can tell you that people are not financially literate in case of India. We do not know what exactly we need. Different people will have different requirements. So our product should also be catered according to that. But since we have not focused on diversifying products, and at the same time people themselves do not know what is exactly required by them, so there is always this mismatch. On top of that, there is high transaction costs. Whenever you are trying to get a loan, you have to again go to this place multiple times. Again, you have to repay it. Many people will not be having digital access, so they cannot repay it. So transaction costs are high. On top of that, you have high information asymmetry. So all these things creates problems. This is something that we need to bridge over a period of time.
Are there unintended consequences from trying to speed up financial inclusion?
There can be. For example, people not repaying money on time. So not only unintended consequences, there will also be very high opportunity costs. Okay, so both things are there. But one thing has been proven again and again. This is more of a myth. If you look at the work of Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo in Poor Economics, they find out that the repayment rates for poor is higher as compared to the repayment rates of those who are affluent.
Yeah.
Okay, so there is generally this myth that if you are giving loans to people, it might backfire, but it is not the case. Some of them might become again bad assets, but the rate will be less. And Ujjivan Microfinance is one of the success stories, and just look at their numbers, look at what they have done. They have been very, very innovative. For example, one of the issue that poor people face is most likely they are not digitally literate, most likely they are not literate. So what they are doing, they are using different language-based systems, and they are focusing on vernacular languages so that people can easily access. People might not be able to read things, so they are using graphics for different kind of services that they are providing. So they are trying to reach at that population which possibly we could not have catered to in the past. And this is a huge sector. Around 300 million people will be, the size of the market is around 300 million. Wow. Right now, Ujjivan is servicing around 5 million clients. And they're again having, the assets are around $1.8 billion. Their average return from the assets is 2.5% per year. And the losses are around 0.3%. So they are in that safe zone.
So we could actually see a sort of renaissance in microfinance in India again.
Maybe. Again, we never know how things pan out, because if I'm not wrong, few years back, there was another player in the market in Andhra Pradesh. Again,
what's it called?
SKS Microfinance. SKS. Yeah, it backfired back then.
So this whole discussion about unintended consequences got me thinking once again about China. And I'm wondering if I can get you to go back to China and see if, are there things that the Chinese government is doing right now in response to the Wuhan virus that has unintended consequences?
Yeah, there might be unintended consequences. Right now, the central bank has pumped in around $172 billion. So again, which can become bad debts in future. Apart from that, they are increasing their capacities when it comes to production of different healthcare equipments. For example, masks and other equipments which is required to tackle this virus. So over a period of time, there can be a problem of overcapacity. Now you are asking the producers to manufacture this, but will you be compensating them afterwards? Also, they're trying to meddle with the markets so that people don't sell their shares. And I told you, since January 20th, prices of the stocks has fallen by 10%. So meddling with the markets can also have implications. Also, there are some reports that officials are asking the landlords to be lenient towards commercial tenants. So again, when you are interfering in all these things, there can be unintended consequences. Also, there was supposed to be a policy by which the private players would have increased their social security spending in China. So it was going to be mandatory, but since the condition is not right at present, so they have delayed it at least for the next 3 months. Again, so multiple areas can get impacted.
Yeah, I can just imagine that this is a disruption that's going to last for a while.
Yeah, while. And we don't know what is the scale. So last time in 2002, when there was this SARS outbreak, so the impact of that outbreak was around $30 to $35 billion. And one thing has to be kept in mind, that coronavirus is spreading 6 times faster than SARS virus. And also at that point of time, Chinese economy was not as globally integrated as it is right now. So again, the impacts can be.
Yeah. I'm going to close today's episode with yet another story on misspent money. This is on Britain's nuclear weapons program. There's a report from Britain's National Audit Office, which basically says that in the process of modernizing Britain's nuclear forces, a great deal of money has been spent. Costs have ballooned up to £1.35 billion, which is over twice of the original estimate that they had outlaid. So this is for a variety of reasons. There are basically 3 distinct projects. One is to build the so-called dreadnought class of nuclear submarines that will house these nuclear missiles. The second is to build the nuclear reactors that will power these submarines. And the third is actually assembling the warheads. Now, just to briefly talk about the UK's nuclear deterrent. So the UK's nuclear deterrent is entirely at sea, and it's a so-called continuous at-sea deterrent, which means that it has a complex of 4 nuclear submarines, and there's always at least one of them out at sea. And what is a ballistic missile?
Who are they deterring?
Good question. We will just get to that. So here's how. What is a ballistic missile nuclear submarine? It's nuclear in 2 ways. One is it's powered by a nuclear reactor, and 2, it has nuclear missiles. Yeah. And the rationale for putting, of course, submarines out to sea with nuclear missiles is that they're harder to detect, and so potentially can survive a disarming strike.
So even if the entirety of the UK and all of its other nukes are totally wiped out, by some unnamed entity who, for some reason, actually want to attack Britain, this submarine would potentially be able to take revenge.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, the big question, of course, and this is a huge debate that actually came up in 2017 in the UK, which is, did Britain need its nuclear weapons program? Britain calls its nuclear weapons program quite confusingly Trident. Trident 2D5 is also the name of the missile that they use, but they're two different things. And I mean, this is such an expensive program. What is the obvious nuclear threat that Britain faces? Is quite a mystery to everyone. Even its backers were not quite able to put their finger on what exactly they were deterring. But I think it's one of those legacy programs that the British will simply refuse to let go of. I think partly simply because of prestige.
If only they would let go of their nuclear program as easily as they let go of their responsibility towards all their colonies.
Yeah, and what this gets me thinking about is nuclear modernization in other parts of the world. So you have a very expensive nuclear modernization program going on in the United States. India is also going to have to undertake nuclear modernization at some point.
Yep.
We don't know the size of India's nuclear forces, its exact composition. We don't know how much money is being outlaid for it. And when nuclear modernization costs, what is that bill going to look like? So a great deal of our debates about, for instance, what should India's nuclear posture be? Should India have no first use or not? Seems to be completely devoid of this basic context of what on earth is India spending? If India were to, for example, expand its nuclear forces for some reason, what would it cost to maintain that, to overhaul it, to modernize it? I think that we need to demand some degree of transparency in India in these matters so that we can actually have a more informed debate in public. This story also comes at a rather strange time when, so obviously Britain has left the EU and Donald Trump doesn't seem to be a very reliable NATO ally to European states. And there are once again talks, just like there were in 2018, there are once again talks about a Euro deterrent. This Euro deterrent, of course, is not going to be in the hands of Germans, don't worry. It's going to be, what they really mean is that France will have a sort of pan-European nuclear deterrent strategy. France is, of course, that other country that quite inexplicably holds on to its nuclear weapons. About 80% of its deterrent is at sea, rather like with the UK, but another 20% can be delivered from the air by airplanes. So the idea is that there will be a dialogue with other European countries and they will figure out how to create an atmosphere of deterrence that will benefit the EU in some way. I don't quite understand how nuclear deterrence is actually going to address some of the key security problems that EU faces today. For instance, a small incursion by Russia into a Baltic state.
How can you use a nuclear weapon to deter them?
Yeah, so I mean, the idea with nuclear weapons is, of course, that they induce caution of some sort. I mean, that's the theory.
Clearly, the Russians were very cautious in 2014.
Absolutely, yeah. The puzzle of why countries like the UK and the France retain these extensive nuclear arsenals continues. And in the meantime, I think the lesson for India to draw is we should know what the bill is from our nuclear weapons program. All right. This has been a very interesting discussion. We've been all over the place, and I think we'll learn more in 20 minutes than we normally do. Thank you so much, Sarthak and Anirudh.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on All Things Policy.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.
I hope you enjoyed that show. We'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week. Thank you, HDFC Life, for coming on board. Also, would like to thank Storytel for continuing the long time advertising that they've been doing with us. And if you have a brand and you'd like to advertise with us, please send us an email. We'd love to talk to you. And let me tell you a couple of things that you should check out this week. On States of Anarchy, Humsani talks about the Brazil-India relationship. On Agla Station Adulthood, Ayushi and Ritasha talk about pleasure, sex, and much more. On a nostalgia-laden episode of the Geek Fruit podcast, Tejas and Dinkar go back to the franchise with the Sam Raimi, Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies and talk about how they hold up today, 12 years after the last movie came out. On our Kannada podcast Thalle Harate, scholar Avinash Amble combines neuroscience, mathematical logic and the cutting edge of computer science to explain the history of machine vision to Pawan and Surya. On Tapri Tales, Madhuri weaves the tale around a conversation between three friends. Thanks and keep listening.
Janice, what do you think couples did before TV was invented?
I don't know, go for walks on the beach, long drives, fancy dinners, have more sex maybe?
But what did we do when we decided to move in together? We debated between the Chromecast and the Fire Stick.
We gave up on sleeping early so we could stay up watching true crime shows.
We got ourselves 3 cat babies.
And basically became the cutest couch potatoes around.
Okay then.
In case you guys still haven't got it, we are a TV crazy, Netflix loving, binge watching Mr. and Mrs.
I'm Anirudh Kanisetti.
I'm Janice Sequeira.
And if like us, you snort TV for breakfast, lunch and dinner, this is the podcast for you.
Tune in every Thursday on the IVM podcast app or wherever it is that you get your podcast from. This is
Mr.
and Mrs.
Binge Watch.